Okay. Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar organized by Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. We're gathered here today to discuss the Houthi factor, Gaza, the axis of resistance, and Middle East stability. So, the evolving situation in Yemen has recently expanded beyond borders again to include new players, layers, and complexities, particularly following the de-escalation roadmap freeze in December 2023. In recent months, the conflict has seen significant developments. The Houthis, backed by Iran, have intervened purportedly to support the Palestinians by launching direct attacks against Israel, but also launching the equivalent of an economic blockade on Red Sea and Gulf of Aden traffic, which affects about 12% of global maritime trade. The United States and the European Union, in response, formed defensive military coalitions to deter further Houthi attacks, and these have not necessarily succeeded. This aspect of conflict further escalated when Israel conducted airstrike on the Yemeni port of Hodeidah, destroying port cranes as well as oil infrastructure at the port in retaliation for the first successful Houthi-launched drone strike into Java on July 20. These recent events underscore the growing influence of the Houthis and their regional role within the axis of resistance. However, they also overshadow the core issues and dynamics that play out in Yemen. So today, to help us navigate these dynamics, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts who will share their insights on the regional domestic implications of these developments, as well as geopolitical shifts they represent. Allow me to introduce, first of all, Dr. Abdulkhaleq Abdullah, who's a retired professor of political science and a senior fellow with the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's a leading scholar in Gulf politics with deep expertise on the political security dynamics within the region. Second of all, we have Nadwa al-Dawsari, who's a veteran researcher, conflict analyst, and a policy advisor with 20 years of field experience in Yemen and the broader region. Nadwa brings extensive on-the-ground experience exploring tribal mediation, conflict dynamics, and implications of international interventions in Yemen conflict-affected states. Third of all, we have Tamer Badawi, who's a graduate research assistant and a PhD candidate at Kent University, and his work focuses on security, governance, and stabilization within the Middle East. And finally, we're joined by Afrah Nasser, who's a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. She's a recipient of the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award and formerly worked as a researcher with the Human Rights Watch. She's a prominent voice in human rights in Yemen and has focused with his research on that. We're honored to be joined by our esteemed panelists, and I look forward today to a rich and informative discussion. So our discussion will last for about an hour, and we'll begin the first 30 to 40 minutes with moderated discussion, and then followed by Q&A. I invite you all to please throw your Q&A in the chat box, and we'll pick up your questions sequentially from there. So to begin our discussion, start the conversation today, let's begin with the bigger picture in the region. I'll begin with Dr. Abdulkhaleq Abdullah to explore the regional implications. Dr. Abdulkhaleq, given your understanding as both a UAE national, as a security expert, you've seen the tremendous growth in Houthi capabilities with a strike capability reaching up to 2,000 kilometers. What do you see as the primary threats and risks this transnational capability that's sort of ungoverned now? What does it pose for GCC states, particularly the UAE, within the evolving regional calculus and power dynamics?
Introduction, and of course thanks to Carnegie Middle East for organizing the webinar, and I'm so happy to join Nadwa, Afrah, and أيضا Tamer for this timely session. The Houthi is posing as a huge security concern for the Arab Gulf states, for the Middle East, and for the stability and the security of the global shipping lines. So, number one, it's a very huge security concern that was not there a few years ago before they took over power in Sana'a. But the way the Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the West, view the Houthi threat is through Iran. Houthi is seen as part and parcel of the bigger threat that Iran poses to the stability of the Gulf states and to the Middle East in general. So it's an extension of the Iranian threat. That's how we see the Houthi, and that's how the Houthis are coming across to us, and that's how the Houthis are affirming themselves as being part and parcel of this resistance axis led by Tehran. So that's one thing, and the second thing. And the third thing is that as part of Iran threat, Iran traditionally used to come across as a threat from the east. That's where it is geographically located. But nowadays, Iran comes across as a threat from the south or the west, however you look at it, and the north. So Iran, in a way, is kind of making this huge encirclement of the Gulf states, and the Houthi is just one pawn in this bigger Iranian regional threat. So in that sense, the question then comes, how do you deal with the Houthis? The question that you just posed, how the Arab Gulf states, the six of them, not just the UAE, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the rest, how do they deal with the Houthi, with the growing Houthi threat to regional security? There are a couple of very quick way of looking at how do the Arab Gulf states deal with the Houthi, with the growing Houthi threat. Number one, reach out to Iran. And that's what we have been doing for the past 4 years. We have reached out to Iran to de-escalate regional tension. Second of all, talk directly to the Houthi, and that's what Saudi Arabia is doing on behalf of everybody else. So we're talking directly also to the Houthis to see if there is any ground for fruitful conversation and reaching out with a deal. So that's the second way to deal with the Houthis. And the third way is to boost our own defenses, missile, drone missiles, defenses. And I think the Arab Gulf states, UAE in that case, will not spare a dime or a dollar to have the best of the defense system against Houthi and the Iranian threat. And maybe in that regard, fourthly, or whatever, I think we have already kept, for the last 40 plus years dealing with the Iran threat, we have kept our security, we have kept our prosperity fairly well throughout. So we have learned the art of dealing with threats. We, after all, live next to Iran, and now we live next to Houthi, and we live in a very red zone, and we know, and we've proven to be capable of dealing with any kind of threat, whether it is the Houthi or otherwise. And finally, I think, not just we are good at handling these threats and keeping our security, but also I think we have managed to keep our influence, our prosperity, the fact that the Arab Gulf states are emerging now as a regional powerhouse, and the fact that this is, after all, as I have always been saying, the Gulf moment. So I think these are some of the things we will be dealing with the growing Houthi threat with the confidence that the Arab Gulf states are exhibiting, and they have done so, and I think we have been very successful so far, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulkhaleq. You highlighted the dilemma of encirclement, as you rightly stated, from multiple directions by a number of pro-Iranian actors, in which the Houthis are just one node. And you clearly spoke about, you know, the way in which several Gulf states, particularly the UAE, have also navigated what you call the art of dealing with threats over the past, you know, couple decades, while advancing their national interests and maintaining greater values of prosperity, development, but also security. And you touched also on an interesting point of you know, the perhaps the art of learning has been in the development for some states more than others. And if I might just follow up and stretch that with one more question, we've seen the resurfacing Houthi threat to target Saudi vital infrastructure, with the top leader saying Saudi ports for a port, airports for airports, in what seems to be now developing a deterrence or a credible tool of actually extortion in the long term. If you don't give us what we want in terms of economic incentives, and that might transpire in different formats moving on in the future, how can also the Gulf states, particularly who receive these threats in a more regular basis, given that we are now sort of in a moment maybe of transition, where the region is more susceptible towards more escalation, or sort of entry points for de-escalation in the coming, not necessarily months, but years. How do you see the management of this tool of extortion in the long term when you have economic aspirations in the Gulf states to move to the next level of achievements?
Well, since October 7 and the war that Israel has waged on Gaza, of course, the Houthis managed to go to capture on this crisis and feel emboldened as a result. So there is this new, more emboldened Houthi that we have seen. And as a result, they come across with all these threats. But Ibrahim, we are used to these threats. We live next to all sorts of threats, and the neighborhood is full of threats on a daily basis since day one, when the Iranian Revolution started in 1979. So threats is the threat, and we've been keeping up with these threats. We listen to them, and we have never responded with a threat. So whatever the Houthis are saying, we take it as serious. The Arab Gulf state, that is, they take it very seriously, but they also know that threat is a threat, and try to not dramatize it. And we have never been overwhelmed by this threat. That's number one. Number two, I think we have seen lately that there is an escalation in the region, and we might even see some kind of an open confrontation between the two power in the region, Israel on the one hand and Iran, and it could get out of hand. So we are ready for every single eventuality, whatever it is. We have nothing to do with this escalation. We're not going to be party to it. We're not going to side with anybody, neither Iran or Israel or Houthis or anybody else. We will keep our neutrality, and that is what we have been doing so far, and that's what we will keep doing as we go through this escalation. Hopefully it doesn't get out of hand. Hopefully we don't see a major war, regional war, but the region has gone through several wars, 4 of them in the Gulf in the past 30 plus years, and we came every time stronger, every time more confident. So despite all these threats that we hear, and we take it very seriously, we know how to not to respond with threat, but at the same time, we try to make our security and stability a top priority, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulkhaleq, for your inputs. They're indeed very useful. If I may now shift a little bit the discussion from this broader regional outlook and move to Nadwa. Nadwa, we've seen what was once an internal war in Yemen, short of an armed conflict in 2004, become a national or sort of an armed conflict in 2014. In 2015, it became a regionalized war. In 2016-17, it expanded to the maritime domain for the first time in the Red Sea. In 2023, we saw that expansion again to affect the global maritime trade. And we've seen maybe a test of this capability going into as far as, occupied Palestinian territories or Israel. So what are the internal motives that drive the Houthis to take regional adventure as such? Could you please unpack some of these, including maybe ideological aspects, and then maybe connect it to the broader, motives within the axis, if you could?
Yes, thank you. I think for those who understand the Houthis, this doesn't come as a surprise, but as a natural evolution of the movement. But in order to understand why the Houthis are doing what they're doing, it's important to also go back to what they've been doing before the Red Sea attacks and their expansion over the past or since last November. The Houthis have been consolidating power, political and military power in Yemen since 2004, particularly since 2014, since the war started. Now they control most of the north, with the exception of Marib and some areas on the border with Saudi Arabia. They have a repressive police state that exerts control over the population, curtailed civil liberties, suppressed dissents, and enforced ideological conformity, which is the most important thing. There has been a growing resistance against the Houthis over the past couple of years because of their widespread corruption, repression, and the lack of governance. There were protests demanding salaries. People in the north have been without salaries since 2016. And also in the anniversary of the 61st anniversary of September 26th revolution that overthrew the imamate in 1962, there were massive protests in Sana'a symbolizing resistance against the Houthi rule because enemies perceived the Houthis as an extension of the imamate, which was a theological, repressive regime that isolated Yemen and ruled the north for hundreds of years. So the Gaza war came as a great opportunity for the Houthis to deal with their domestic issues or domestic agenda, while also achieve their short-term and long-term goals. First, I think there's some unmuted mic. It's just distracting. Can you? Okay. So the Houthis consolidate. Well, first, doing this first and foremost to consolidate their power domestically. Widespread. There's background noise.
Could we please just all mute our? Yeah, we can all mute. Maybe except for.
Thank you. So first, they want to consolidate their power domestically, taking advantage of the widespread anger about Gaza and sympathy with the Palestinian cause in general to rally people's support, Yemeni people's support for them, and also taking advantage of the situation to further repress and control the population. Now, they're the defenders of the Palestinian cause, and so they feel more entitled to more, conformity by the population. They took this opportunity to dismantle civil society. And last June, since June, there's been crackdown on civil society. Dozens of civil society leaders, UN and NGO staff, and businessmen were abducted and disappeared by the Houthis, and they were who accused them of spying for the CIA and Mossad. So linking that to this new war with Israel, and also to help the Houthis control international aid coming to their areas. This is part of their domestic agenda. But regionally, this also is an opportunity for the Houthis to extract more concessions from the Saudis, which you've mentioned, Ibrahim. The Houthis mastered the art of extortion, particularly with the Saudis. The Houthis are demanding a large economic package as part of the roadmap. They want the Saudis to leave Yemen, which the Saudis themselves are eager to leave, and exit the war and normalize with Iran. And the Houthis know that. They know that the Saudis are eager to do that. And so they're taking advantage of the situation to extort more concessions from the Saudis. And we've seen that happening over the past month. Recently, the Saudis forced the government to backtrack its decision to cut off Houthis from the international banking system. And also the Houthis got more flight and destinations in and out of Sana'a, and no longer approved by Riyadh as before. Last month, a Yemeni flight flew directly to Amman and then to Beirut without registering, and then flew from Beirut back to Sana'a. So they're getting more concessions from the Saudis. But also the Houthis are doing this to project themselves as a regional power and a key actor in Iran's axis of resistance. And they're the only ones who really stood up to Israel. They're the only ones that struck inside Israel, causing casualties since the beginning of the Gaza war. And that taps into the pro-Palestine and anti-Israel sentiment among Arabs and Muslims. And by that, the Houthis present themselves as the new leader of the Islamic world who earned this leadership by acting against, well, the enemy of the Muslim world, which is Israel. As perceived, of course. They also, they want to push the Saudis out and then the US out of the region, which is something in that order. And it's something that they share with the axis of resistance. And long-term ideological goal, and this is hard for some people to understand, but ideology is what drives the Houthis. Their long-term ideological goal is destroying Israel and establishing an Islamic government that's based in Jerusalem. And this is something they share also with the axis of resistance. The Red Sea battle, the war against Israel that the Houthis have launched now, they call it the battle of promised conquest and holy jihad. And so these are the Houthis' motives, and they're largely successful because they know how to use offensive to extract gains from their enemies, and they understand that the regional powers and international community have very little appetite to escalation, and they're keen on containing the situation rather than dealing with it, and so it's working in their favor so far. I'll leave it at that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
No, thank you very much, Nadwa, for your valuable input. You explained the motives very well and looked at the domestic drivers, the regional ambitions, and also how they've been leveraging their capability, reputational gains made, and what they seek to represent themselves by, from the attacks launched both in the maritime domain or cross-border attacks into Israel. In 1 minute, if you could, how does this reflect on domestic conflict and pathways for peace in Yemen? How do people see the Houthis now vis-a-vis before October 7 when they were protesting before? Can this image hold? And if there is a pathway for sustainable peace? In 1 minute, if you could, please.
Yes, I mean, a lot of Yemenis support what the Houthis are doing against Israel and in support of Gaza. There's no question about that, because Palestine is a very important cause for Yemenis and Arabs and Muslims. But that does not translate into a support of the group, not necessarily, okay? What Yemenis want is, they want, the Houthis are hugely repressive. They're refusing to provide services and govern. And also they have a sectarian agenda that's very strange to Yemenis. It's a supremacist agenda. The Houthis believe that they are superior to Yemenis because they descend from Prophet Muhammad, and that's and that's like Yemenis largely are against that. So just because they support what the Houthis are doing against Israel, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're supporting supporting the Houthis. And we're seeing continued resistance against the Houthis, as we've seen in Bayda last week. The clashes between the tribes and the Houthis. And so it doesn't mean that people will support Houthis because of their actions against Israel.
That's very useful. Thank you for this as well, and linking into recent events. That's very indeed useful. If I may transition a little bit now from what Nadwa described on the local motives of the Houthis, and she mentioned also one of the concessions being more flight destinations or resumption of certain things, that for the first time a Yemeni airline flight flew into Beirut and they went back all the way to Sana'a. That's never happened publicly, at least since March 2015. If I move to Tamer, who's written recently a fantastic piece about Houthi Iraqi paramilitary groups' relations. Tamer would like to delve a little bit into that relationship. In the past, people knew, southern Lebanon. They knew Syria being two theaters from which the Houthis received support. In addition, of course, to Tehran. As a fourth base now, can you tell us when did this start? What is the scope of the relationship? What are the benefits that the Houthis generate from operating now from Iraq?
Well, first, thank you very much, Ibrahim, for organizing this panel and being with such a bright lineup of analysts from the region. So let me start with this, that the earliest publicly recorded encounter between Ansarullah, or the Houthis, and the Iraqi groups is around May 2015. And this happened through a Houthi delegation to Baghdad, where a member of the political council met with the Prime Minister Nour al-Maliki and his deputy, and also a member of the political council of Kataib Hezbollah. And Kataib Hezbollah is a top-tier Iraqi resistance group that is very close to Iran. So this is around perhaps 9 years ago, but even the Houthi presence in Baghdad is reportedly even older than this. So one narrative I've heard is that they've been there since 2011. And actually it does make sense because the Houthis did establish al-Masira channel in Beirut in 2012. And establishing it would perhaps take around a year. So I think they developed a presence in Beirut and in Baghdad around the same time. And it's probably that it was very modest and very small, that it did not really attract attention, especially also that the axis of resistance did not operate on the same scale it is operating today. So we would say now that the relationship between the Iraqi groups and the Houthis might be over a decade, maybe 13 years if we're talking about 2011. So this is how old the relationship is. Should I move on to the militant aspect, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So now the relationship that connects the Houthis and the Iraqi resistance groups is based on three pillars, and I think Nadwa mentioned some of them in her contribution. So ideological, they're members of one league, the axis of resistance. Two, militant. A militant aspect is that now they're running joint operations with the Iraqi resistance group, and they're exchanging expertise. Three is financial, is that through donations that Kataib Hezbollah has collected in the past, they've been supporting also the Houthis financially. So those are the three pillars that connects Ansarullah with the Iraqi groups. Now, the strategic consideration under which the Houthis and the Iraqi groups work together and operate is shaped by three elements. One, which Dr. Abdulkhaleq mentioned earlier, is their interest in encircling Saudi Arabia and surrounding countries. Two is their hostility to Israel, and of course, attacks on Israel does support their ideological credentials in the region. And number three is Iran's willingness to push out American forces out of the region. So the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, in 2020, after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Khamenei, he called for the withdrawal of US troops from the region, from West Asia. And West Asia is synonymous with the Middle East, which also comprises Yemen. So all of those Houthi attacks also on US ships, they're also, I think, included within the mantle of what Khamenei is calling for. Now, what is Iraq offering differently from Beirut or other locations in the region? Well, in terms of geography, the presence in Iraq and the leeway they have, the presence, the envoy that they have there, and the way he's appearing everywhere, it's very symbolic. And why is it symbolic? Again, because Iraq is adjacent to Saudi Arabia. So it says that the Houthis have a presence next door. Also, Iraq is socially hospitable to the Houthis because both the Iraqi resistance groups and the Houthis, they have a strong troubled background. So it makes them cynic. I mean, I think sometimes people may underestimate the importance of socialization. People need to like each other. And this common tribal background makes them work well together, I think. In terms of resources, Iraq is different from Lebanon and Iran in terms of that it has all resources and it doesn't have US sanctions imposed on it, which means that if actors in Iraq have access to the state as sub-state armed groups, and if they would like to give Houthis resources, they could, which is not, I mean, exactly the case with Lebanon or other countries. I mean, Iran has oil, but it has sanctions imposed on it. So Iraq, financially, it's different. It's a little bit different. Now, in terms of actors, in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah, you have Palestinian resistance groups, but those are numerically limited in terms of the number of actors. But in Iraq, you have a plethora of actors. You have a lot of armed groups, which means that the space to exchange expertise is greater even. So those are the three reasons why, or four reasons why Iraq is a unique location for the Houthis or Ansarullah. I hope I did.
Yeah, that's indeed. Yeah, you answered my next question as well. So you did mention, the pillars of the relationship. You explained the ideological exchange of expertise, coordination, and the joint military operations launched in June, in addition to what Iraq can offer relatively more possibly than other entities because of the lack of sanctions and there being, integral or integrated entities within the state, so to act as state within the state. And you touched upon an interesting point specifically on oil. It's been always mentioned in the past that free Iranian oil has been flowing into Yemen, and there have been also some reports indicating that the origin of that is not necessarily Iran, but instead it might be possibly Iraq. And some of that explains actually, some of the dynamics that have shaped the strategic significance of Iraq as a base to offer, the Houthis with indirect, sort of less scrutinized packages of technical, advisory, financial, and in-kind support. You've also spoke about the strategic considerations, which tied up to Dr. Abdullah's, strategic encirclement of the Gulf And you also mentioned the hostility of Israel to Israel, and that's maybe shared in their ideological teachings. But many doubt the extent to which this has gone enough to put them in direct confrontation that actually threatens or shakes the political orders of these regimes. And then you spoke finally about the freedom that the Houthi representative in Iraq has, including through official meetings or being hosted and celebrated, given that Yemen is the origin of Arabs, and that helps many navigate their social mobility and integration with utmost ease, actually. And that indeed is a sort of a nuanced sketch of the dynamics at play for the Houthis in Iraq. If I might have one follow-up question in 1 or 2 minutes, if you might, and that relates into the position of Iraq. Iraq had played a key mediation role in the past under Prime Minister al-Kadhimi. It hosted Iranian-Saudi talks, and then that did not necessarily build momentum with successive regimes in Iraq. Now that they have the Houthis in, and that's regionally acknowledged, it's now no longer an open secret as it was in the past. How does this affect Iraq's regional ambitions in the mediation landscape, in sort of reclaiming the role Iraq had 2 decades ago in terms of influence? And does hosting entities as such being, subject to Iraq or poses some forms of risks to Iraq or its ambitions in any way? So you have one, the opportunities that Iraq has, and the other, any potential risks that you might see. You're mute, unfortunately.
I always forget. Thank you, Ibrahim. It's a very good question, because I was also wondering the same, since I published this piece, and then also other pieces have been published afterwards about the Houthis in Iraq and their bureau there, and how active the envoy is. And interestingly, the government, I don't think it has commented, the Iraqi government through the Prime Ministry or through the Foreign Ministry, I don't think they commented on this issue. And what it does seem like is that the Iraqi government wants to maintain a margin of maneuverability. They don't want to speak about it unless they have to. And so far, none of the countries in the region, such as, or mainly Saudi Arabia, it hasn't publicly speaking about it. Saudi media, has been speaking about this. But it doesn't seem like their presence now has urged anyone to make a public statement. Now, the importance of this is that the longer the Houthi presence does not irk anyone enough to speak about it, like in terms of regional countries, like complaining about the Houthi presence, the more Iraq can leverage this during regional talks. Then Iraq can say, perhaps we can try to intervene. We can try to mediate between the Ansarullah and Saudi Arabia, or between Ansarullah and other countries. So this is my thinking, is that they want to leverage this presence during regional talks. But should the Houthis perhaps take part in joint action, for example, with Kataib Hezbollah or other groups in Iraq against Saudi Arabia? So I think Baghdad will be in a very difficult situation to leverage the Houthi presence in mediation in the region. So I think the situation is fluid, and I think Baghdad will seize opportunities when it sees there are opportunities. However, it will be under immense pressure when the Houthis and the Iraqi groups, one day in the future, it's likely happening, when they will jointly strike Saudi Arabia or other countries in the region.
Interesting. Thank you for touching points on, first of all, the space of maneuverability that it has given possibly the Iranian government. given that nothing public has been flagged, not necessarily in private discussions between regional governments. And second of all, that this could be an avenue for regional influence. But you also mentioned, and we've seen it, we saw it in July, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, particularly Kataib Hezbollah, if I'm unmistaken, issued threats just a couple days after the Houthis threatened to resume cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia. And the primary purpose of that was seen to give more credibility to Houthi threats, but also to show that the disruption could now publicly be acknowledged from the south and north of Saudi Arabia. And that strategic encirclement with credible capability that's strikeable and more evolving drones that can have a degree of maneuverability, or even if you launch, complex attacks in the forms of number of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, reconnaissance drones, booby-trapped boats, they can penetrate defenses with utmost ease. You might have an accuracy rate of intercepting, say, 70, 80, 90%. But if you have the 10% hitting the damage of 30, 40 projectiles, or if you do it the Iranian way, as we saw in April into Israel, of 350 missiles and drones, that could inflict a degree of damage. And we might follow up on that question after I go to Afrah, if our time allows. Thank you very much, Tamer, for your valuable insights on this. And more than welcome. If I move quickly to Afrah, and Afrah had visited Sana'a in the last couple of years, and she's seen the change that took place in Sana'a. She lived in Sana'a in the past. She visited Sana'a recently, and she had some reflections from her last visit. Afrah, if we might begin, and Nadwa had touched a little bit very briefly about the reputational gains and change in regional perception of Houthi image post-October 7, many would argue that this very image is challenged by domestic or local realities in Yemen, by the Houthi-Iraqi itself. And so the question is, how sustainable do you think that the reputational gains, the image perception outside Yemen can sustain itself vis-a-vis governance shortcomings, lack of salary payments, lack of protections or freedom, increasing, vanishing space for political pluralism, as we've seen with the GPC, just with the Houthi latest announcements, governmental, which is non-recognized, just between brackets. What does it mean for as much as Yemenis inside Yemen are concerned on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, first, thank you, Ibrahim, for having me. Some points were already raised by Nadwa, so excuse the repetition. If we examine the sustainability of the Houthis' reputational gains inside Yemen, I think we must first acknowledge the control they have established over key state institutions, maintaining a strong grip on northern Yemen. The regional activities, the recent ones, have boosted their external image, drawing attention away from pressing internal problems. But it's crucial also to recognize that these external engagements cannot indefinitely overshadow significant domestic issues. The Houthis face persistent issues, including economic hardships, governance failures, unpaid salaries, basically a population suffocated by the group's oppressive extortion and tyranny. These issues pose a critical threat to their existence and to their, let's say, their post-October 7 support base. The Houthis' current strategy of relying on external activities to divert attention from domestic problems has also its limits. Internal dissatisfaction is growing, driven by many issues, primarily economic difficulties and lack of basic services. And to maintain their reputational gains, I think the Houthis need to address those domestic challenges. However, this may prove difficult for them to their lack of governance experience, as their primary expertise lies in warfare rather than effective administration. A key aspect of the Houthis' reputation is its connection to their historical narrative. They have positioned themselves as defenders of Yemen against external threats, drawing on, as they claim, their roots as a movement resisting foreign interference. This narrative is deeply tied to the fact that the Houthi family leadership claims legitimacy as members of the Sayyid class or direct dissidents of the Prophet Muhammad. Plus, by presenting themselves as both defenders of Palestine and protectors of Yemeni sovereignty, the Houthis resonate with many in the Arab world who are thirsty of such solidarity with Palestine. But this framing allows them to maintain a narrative of resistance amidst this countless domestic governance issues and criticism. However, this narrative alone is absolutely insufficient. They must support this narrative with tangible actions that align with governance expectations and services delivery. One starting point could be demonstrating a political will to reach a political deal with all Yemeni warring parties. I think ultimately the group's future depends on the future of Yemen. The Houthis' reputational gains may become irrelevant if they fail to fulfill their promises of stability and prosperity. Like my last thought on this, the Yemeni people really deserve a government that provides them with a dignified life. To you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Afrah. So you described the Houthis as a group that has suffocated people, within their, held territories, and you highlighted a wide array of shortcoming of governance, a way in which they see governance as benefits without commitments to the public. And that doesn't sound too promising, even ahead of a political process, because actually there hasn't been one. And the whole track record of peace agreements and ceasefires over the past 2 decades since 2004, and you sort of even had more questions on whether they would be keen on meeting these expectations moving forward. And we've seen them also recently being emboldened by accusing the champions of humanitarian and development work, who've been working for about 3 decades of their timeline, who were studied overseas in the US and the UK and Europe, or even in Iraq in its prime age. And they learned languages, they learned skills, they worked with international organizations, and they developed a long career that's focused on advancing their country's national interest from these very organizations or even diplomatic missions. And they were framed as a spy or an American Zionist spy, just all overnight. How do you see this crackdown on humanitarian development and civil society champions reflecting on the broader aspects of life in Yemen, and what it means for humanitarian operations and post-war recovery processes if most of those who would be replaced by them are from within the system itself?
Yeah. I mean, this crackdown is not new, but I think the Houthis' recent gains impacted public freedoms and civic engagement and relief work in general. It's like it gave the Houthis another excuse to continue their already oppressive practices. So as Nadwa mentioned earlier, in June, we saw that Houthi group escalated their arbitrary arrest and enforced disappearances, targeting tens of individuals, such as civil society workers and staff members for the UN, including one staff working at the UN envoy for Yemen office, which is really bizarre. So in June, directors of many UN organizations and international NGOs working in Yemen published a joint statement discussing all these arrests and oppressive practices. And they said these, quote unquote, these detentions are unprecedented, not only in Yemen, but globally. End of quote. This is how the volume or the scale of what happened was really shocking. We're talking about something unprecedented globally. At first glance, these Houthi actions may seem like power consolidation, as Nadwa suggested before, and I totally agree with that. But I think there is also more into it, or in addition, there is another reason, which is actually related to the point I mentioned earlier. I think Houthis lack experience in governance. They are not aware of the damaging consequences of such actions. I say this because last week, unfortunately, we saw deadly flooding in areas controlled by the Houthi group and other parts in Yemen. And there was an extreme lack of emergency and relief operations. And guess what the Houthi authorities thought to do? What happened was the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation in Sana'a, that is controlled by the Houthi army group, issued a press statement calling for international assistance to rescue impacted groups, which they don't even give them the space to work inside Yemen or inside the areas they control with this crackdown and all the restrictions. So thus, the Houthis' crackdown significantly impact humanitarian development and civil society operation, worsening an already dire humanitarian and economic crisis inside the country. To you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Afrah. Thank you. You might have mentioned an interesting point that they lack, governance experience. Some would argue that they have less interest in actually exercising, the authority in what it means by giving and delivering. And there are more plausible questions around that. If your officials are paid, but those who are working at the universities are not paid, like the teachers, the medics, as we've seen with COVID, etc., etc. There is one question on China's position in regional conflicts, and how do they see the Houthis in Yemen? Anyone would like to take a go on that? Dr. Abdulkhaleq or Nadwa, or anybody in 1 minute. How does China sees now this proliferation of armed groups with disruptive capabilities, including for its maritime traffic, given that it's one of the largest industrial countries and exporters of a wide range of equipment and materials? Is anyone like to take a go? And then there is another question: in what ways could Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia affect the Houthi position in Yemen? Who would you like to go for that? Dr. Abdulkhaleq or Nadwa? Or feel free to just mute and jump into it. We have about 4 minutes left. So.
How the normalization, if normalization happens between Israel and Saudi, how would that affect the Houthis in Yemen?
Yes.
I think that's why also the Saudis really are urgently want out of Yemen, because they want to distance themselves from the Yemen conflict, and with that also the Houthis, and make it the Houthis are a Yemeni problem. We're out. We try to help, and we help the Yemenis come to an agreement if this ends in a political settlement or the roadmap. I think long term, the Saudis are a target for the Houthis. So the Saudi-Houthi conflict is going to happen in the future. And normalizing with Israel will only reinforce the Houthis' narrative that they've been pushing for months now, that the Saudis have been, when the Saudis entered the war in Yemen or intervened, they intervened on behalf of Israel and the United States. And so it will only help the Houthis' propaganda. But I don't think that the Saudis have any appetite for escalation with the Houthis, but that's not going to stop the Houthis from coming after the Saudis in the future, which will eventually force the Saudis to deal with the Houthi problem.
Thank you very much, Nadwa. We're getting close to the end of our session today. We might have another 1 or 2 questions, but unfortunately, it seems time is tight. So we've spoken today about a wide range of aspects of what was once only Yemen's problem that has now become a regional and international challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Dr. Abdulkhaleq touched upon the sort of threats that evolved into the Arabian Peninsula. And he made a couple points about the navigation of these sources of concern. They're tied to Iran. So one of the ways is obviously having direct communication with Iran, but also talking to the Houthis. And he mentioned that Saudi Arabia is doing it sort of on behalf of everyone. Dr. Abdulkhaleq also highlighted that a consolidated or an enhanced investment in national defenses, which the UAE has been doing successfully over the past couple decades, and that they have learned also the art of dealing with threats in the past couple decades since 1979. Maybe the scope of these threats have evolved now to have the primary actor not being necessarily traditional state actors, but being either subsidiary actors within the state or paramilitary groups that are increasingly part of Iranians' forward defense. And then he's also noted that the Houthis have been more emboldened, that they made some of these threats in recent times. These points have also been eventually echoed when Nadwa explored the internal and external motives of the Houthis launching cross-border attacks into the Red Sea, more than 100 attacks, including targeting US and Western and the EU's Aspides warships in the Red Sea. And that's, it gives even more fuel to Houthi propaganda and slogans that they used in the past. And the Houthi slogan is exactly the IRGC slogan. And then Nadwa touched point on a common Iranian way of outsourcing problems into the outside when you have more domestic challenges, a strategy of distraction that actually sort of changed the internal calculus when the Houthis had faced all-time high sort of questions to their stability, but also to the expectations of governance, including salary payments, public freedoms, human rights, and political pluralism that Yemen had achieved under the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, increasingly since the unification of the country in 1990. And then Tamer spoke about the pillars of the relationship between the Houthis and Iraqi groups, particularly Kataib Hezbollah, which were honed by nearly a decade of ideological, technical expertise and financial support that have eventually culminated in joint military operations in June this year. And the strategic considerations have including strategic encirclement of the Gulf, which was not a point to make just a decade and a half ago at least. And they also have a strategic goal of pushing the US out of the region, and we've seen that becoming an issue in Iraqi politics. And then finally, Afrah spoke about the human rights record, the challenges that the public face in Yemen on a day-to-day basis, and that whatever the Houthis have gained outside Yemen in terms of image and reputational gains have been largely challenged by domestic realities, possibly since they stormed the capital in September 2014 and then consolidated power after they eliminated the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh in December 2017. And eventually formed counterbalancing state institutions. This has been a very rich and insightful panel. I'm very grateful to Dr. Abdullah, Nadwa, Tamer Badawi, and Afrah for their time and insights. And we thank my colleagues also at Carnegie Middle East Center for hosting this panel on the Houthi factor, Gaza, the Axis resistance, and Middle East stability. We appreciate your time and engagement and look forward to having you and seeing you in future events. Thank you very much, dear panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
Very much, Ibrahim.
Bye.
Bye-bye.